Yes, you may be a perfectly moderate centrist voter, but the moderate voter bloc is a worthless idea, and it's this appeal to the mythical, eulogized centre that is the reason why left-of-centre, progressive, and social democrat political parties have lost so much ground.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in.
They're eating the cats. They're eating
the pets.
Trump just won the US election, completely sweeping the Electoral College, the popular vote, the House, and the Senate. Despite running a pretty campaign compared to 2016, Harris was unable to get Democrat voters to turn out. Senior Democrats were quick to point the blame on the party for being too progressive on things like trans people.
When we address Latino voters as Latinx, for instance, because that's the politically correct thing to do. It makes them think that we don't even live on the same planet as they do. When we are too afraid to say that, hey, college kids, if you're trashing a campus at Columbia University because you're unhappy about some sort of policy and you're taking over a university, and you're trashing it and preventing other students from learning, that is unacceptable. But
someone must tell the usual suspects on the far left that the saying is, when you're in a hole, stop digging, not keep digging. Maybe you missed it because it wasn't on TikTok.
The Democrats have lost because of your toxic, poisonous politics tainting all left-of-center politicians with your mentally ill communism.
This is mainly based on exit polls like this one, which suggested that Harris was weighed down by voters' belief that she focused on liberal cultural issues.
You know, what works for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez right here in New York City, for people who live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it seems alien and foreign to them.
And, I mean, on a surface level, looking at those polling numbers, swing voters seem to be most influenced by the idea that Harris cared more about trans people than the middle class. But I think learning that lesson from exit polls reveals a fundamental problem with the politics of liberals and self-confessed centrists, how they view the electorate and how they see themselves attaining power.
I mean, he didn't get it. Doesn't understand.
There were many short-term blunders the Democrats made that we can ascertain from campaign insiders. They blamed Harris's campaign for being too insular and centralized in the hands of a few Biden campaign managers like Jen O'Malley-Dillon, that allies of O'Malley-Dillon like David Plouffe tried to run an Obama-style campaign and appeal to white suburban moderates by wheeling out non-MAGA Republicans like Liz Cheney.
But how many club championships has she won in golf?
But that doesn't explain the full extent as to why there was such a substantial shift towards Trump. To be clear, the election of Trump and other right-wing populists isn't because of a unique ability to inspire huge turnout in the electorate. These people and parties rely on mass discontent, cynicism, and post-truth politics. And what drives those feelings is necessary to understanding their victories.
We need to keep government on the sidelines. Let the people develop their own skills, solve their own problems, better their own lives.
Back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the world was going through a paradigm shift. The global economy was rewired to unleash and liberate the processes of capital accumulation. The basic idea was, either forcefully or willfully, to cede space, power, leverage to the ruling classes of society, who would then pursue what's best for humanity, and the benefits would eventually trickle down to the rest of us. Examples include big tax cuts for wealthy corporations, the sale of publicly held assets and infrastructure, the abolition of trade barriers like tariffs and exchange controls, the abolition of regulations or red tape, etc., etc.
There is no such thing as public money.
Now, economic output has increased substantially since. However, output proportionate to the population and inflation and employment saw none of that wealth that was supposed to trickle down. Importantly, as stated by the International Monetary Fund or IMF, an institution that often pushed these reforms, income and wealth inequality has grown dramatically. And it's that inequality, the growth in economic insecurity, the growth in social isolation and loneliness, all of which neoliberalism has caused, that has laid the material basis for the social and political setting we see ourselves in today.
Of NAFTA, which basically is a trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada.
It's husband signed NAFTA, which was one of the worst things that ever happened to the manufacturing industry.
That is your opinion.
You go to New England, you go to Ohio, Pennsylvania, you go anywhere you want, Secretary Clinton, and you will see devastation where manufacturing is down 30, 40, sometimes 50%. NAFTA is the worst trade deal maybe ever signed anywhere, but certainly ever signed in this country. And now you want to approve Trans-Pacific Partnership. You were totally in favor of it. Then you heard what I was saying, how bad it is, and you said, I can't win that debate. But you know that if you did win, you would approve that, and that will be almost as bad as NAFTA. Nothing will ever top NAFTA.
While the neoliberal period saw the repealing or modification of policies previously implemented by the Democrats, the party nonetheless fell in line in the 1990s. Bill Clinton went into his presidency wanting to pursue a New Deal and address deindustrialization, policies which were antithetical to the Republicans that came in the 70s and 80s. But Clinton came out of his presidency abandoning those tenets in favor of the Third Way, which began to dominate left-of-center political parties in the 90s and early 2000s. Completely at odds with reversing deindustrialization was the signing of NAFTA, a deal which removed trade barriers between the US, Mexico, and Canada. It basically incentivized companies to outsource their manufacturing from the US, as it costs less for companies to operate facilities in countries like Mexico than in the US. GDP went up, but many workers who had stable, well-paying and unionized manufacturing jobs lost their work, and while they often found work afterwards, it was more insecure, not as well-paying, and more often than not, without a union. While the impact of NAFTA is often overstated by both its detractors and supporters, the deal symbolizes Clinton's and the Democrats' shift to globalization and neoliberalism, and its break from the US labor movement, who was unsupportive of the deal.
But because it became a symbolic struggle for the spirit of our country and for how we would approach this very difficult and rapidly changing world.
What became known as the Third Way, or New Democrats, sought to abandon any semblance of class analysis or perspective in favor of appealing to what they called Middle America, the political center, swing voters, etc., rather than the worker vote or the small business vote. Now, it's worth noting that because the Democrats weren't a Labour Party like the UK Labour Party or a Social Democratic Party like the German SPD, they were already kind of on that track, and so it wasn't as pronounced. Still, there were arrangements such as the New Deal coalition struck between the Democrats and the Labour movement, which suggests that, at least to some extent, Labour was connected to the Democrats. This realignment directly socially and economically disenfranchised a key voter bloc of the Democrats, the working class. The realignment did work for a time, as Clinton won back many of the Reagan Democratic workers who swung rightwards in the 80s by moving economically to the center and deploying that more middle-of-the-road rhetoric. But the reason why workers abandoned the Democrats in the first place was due to their material conditions. It was because the Democrats failed to address stagflation in the 70s under Jimmy Carter, who actually began the process of neoliberalization before Reagan did. From the 70s all the way up to 2016, neoliberalism reigned supreme in the political class. But amongst the electorate, people increasingly became disenchanted with both political parties. Well, yes, nominally people have gotten much wealthier since the 70s, the relative stresses, cost of living, social isolation, and of course inequality has grown with, and in many instances, surpassed their wealth. And this is the material base for mass disenfranchisement, which of course is the product of that period of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism that the Democrats kickstarted and fully embraced.
We are part of a global economy. We're not reversing that. It can't be reversed.
And then Trump comes along.
Pretty clear.
You're the puppet. That's all of his donors and special interests out there. So, that's what it is.
Just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Because you'd be in jail.
What do people do when they're socially and economically disenfranchised, when they're isolated? They react by looking for someone or something to blame. The contradictions or problems of the present class system is set to show people both the issues and how to address them. For example, workers who struggle with low wages or poor safety conditions formed unions to collectively bargain and improve their standing. But people can equally be under a false sense of consciousness. Scapegoats can and have been used to make people feel as if they're understanding what is causing their problems.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
Scapegoats are used by the ruling class to do precisely that. If there's a problem, let's say with widening income and wealth inequality that's causing insecurity and dissatisfaction in regular people, the ruling class through media, lobbying, ads, etc. can use, let's say, immigration or trans people to distract people from the actual cause and benefactors of high inequality, the ruling class. Of course, that's not to say that there may not be any grains of truth in the sentiment, that there are no problems whatsoever with the immigration system, but it's to say that it's ultimately tangential or a sideline to the root of the problem.
Class society.
Trump and the populist right have been excellent at providing a scapegoat, a story, masquerading as a counter-narrative as to why people are feeling like they're losing out and who they should blame. Conversely, the left, which in this context includes everyone from Democrats to communists, haven't been able to do so. So then, why did I say at the beginning that appealing to the mythological censor is a waste of time, and it's ultimately why Trump got elected? Well, because the Democrats, but also other left-wing parties globally, have just been reacting. They see X number of this group supports this thing to this percentage at this time, and they try and tailor their policies and rhetoric to fit that. They're purely reactive, uninspiring, tailored responses to surface-level distractions that have underlying causes, which require systemic changes that upheaves the system they themselves put in place. As argued by Caratha 2013, chasing the censor in this context saw center-left parties capture only loosely affiliated centrist voters who were then quick to withdraw their support in subsequent elections. And this is what was recognized by Trump, who saw millions of previous Obama voters who were disappointed by the Democrats and harnessed that dissatisfaction and cynicism not only as a means to solidify a new base for the Republicans, but to additionally erode voter turnout for the Democrats. He didn't try to only appeal to swing voters and take his base for granted, and on top of that, he destabilized previously democratic strongholds. In short, what has happened is that the socio-economic paradigm shift backed by all major political parties has had significant consequences for the well-being of most of society and delivered ever-increasing wealth and power to a small slither of elites. As people become more and more disenfranchised, they look for answers outside of the current system, or at least what feels or looks like something outside. The right and their ruling class allies, through people like Donald Trump, have been able to capture that discontent and funnel it into electoral success. And this is reaffirmed throughout the literature. There's been loads of research that suggests that the consequences of neoliberalism has directly led to the rise of right-wing populist parties. Even political parties themselves, like the Australian Labor Party, have admitted that their neoliberal policies have destabilized, fractured, and marginalized their fundamental base, a unionized working class. And so to me, it's worthless to try and campaign on being this benign moderate or appealing to the center, because people are sick of it. They're sick of what they perceive to be the status quo. Many of those further on the left don't like to pay too much attention to elections and the infighting of two major mainstream parties, but ultimately I think that's a mistake. Whether we like it or not, most people's eyes are on the major parties and the elections, and so there are key lessons that we can learn from these events and how the major parties act. While it's clear that people can be led astray, that they can be allured by populism that actually doesn't really do much to challenge what they view as the establishment, they can also be guided to become more conscious of their position in our class society. While I think it's beyond the scope of this specific video to go into exactly how we can build effective counterpower today, I do think getting those conversations going is worthwhile. Building and forming structures, institutions, groups of people that exist alongside those existing is a step towards fulfilling the change that so many people want to see.